Hello and welcome back to EESC 418A. This is Lecture 8C, Journal Articles. As I mentioned on the lecture page, there are lots of different types of journal articles. Today I'm just going to focus on the two most common, which are original research articles and literature review articles. So I'll start with original research. This is the most common, and this is what most people will publish as they complete any sort of an academic study. I'll go over the contents briefly, but it's difficult to speak about this in the abstract, so I'll refer you to a really good paper after this, which I've also posted on the lecture page. So in the abstract, we'll provide a summary of everything else that's in the paper, but not copied and pasted material. So we don't just copy and paste from a few lines, which some people unfortunately do, but we want to re-summarize the paper very concisely. And we'll actually go over summaries and executive summaries and abstracts in, I believe, next week or the week after. So stay tuned for talk about abstracts. Next is the introduction. So the introduction sets the reader up by giving them a problem statement. Why is it that we care about this specific topic? And in earth and environmental science, usually there's some environmental issue that needs to be solved, or some technology that needs to be figured out so that we can measure things better, or some fundamental property of the environment that we'd like to learn more about, or some process. Really, we need to lay out that problem statement and let the reader know exactly what it is we're setting out to study and why. And again, since this is earth and environmental science, we usually have some sort of a study area. We're generally going to be basing our study on some environmental samples of some type. So it's good to provide a map and a description of the area. We'll describe maybe the geology and the climate, and a bit of the history of the development of the area if applicable. We'll do a brief literature review in an original research project. This is going to be different from the full literature review that I'll be talking about next. But within any introductory section in an original research article, we need to go over what is known in the research. What does the research tell us to date? And this will set up what are the unknowns that we're trying to solve. And notice that we're now going from the general, from that problem statement of what is our general problem, into the specifics. Next we get into the methods, and the methods and the results are going to be very specific. So we'll start with a study design. A study design isn't very specific to instruments or methods that we're going to do, but what is our general overall study design? How are we going to learn what we need to learn from our data? Next is field sampling. If we've conducted any sort of field sampling, we need to describe in detail how we've done that. What did we do to ensure quality control, that our samples weren't contaminated, that what we measured in the field is actually a valid sample, and how that matches something we might bring back to the lab. If we do some sort of a lab analysis, now we'll start mentioning the specific instruments that are used in the lab, any sort of reagents we've used, any sort of treatment or pre-treatment of our samples, anything that could have possibly altered the sample. And what this does is it allows our reader to understand any limitations of the data that we're going to be producing. Next is a statistical analysis. If we've used some sort of statistics or any other sort of model or numerical analysis, we need to list that. And keep in mind that these are just fairly typical subheadings. These are not set in stone, so these can change quite a bit depending on what we're studying. Next is the results. And typically we'll have some raw findings in the results. Now we're looking at data points, not data summaries. In other words, what did we find from this specific measurement and this specific measurement? We might put the measurements together in a table or a graph, and that helps with the next section, which is the discussion. So now we're going back away from specifics and into the more general. So what are the implications of these findings? And again, we'll go in roughly the same order where we talked about the methods and the results. It helps the reader sort of follow along if we keep similar headings, similar types of chronological flow. So how do these findings compare to reference values? And our reference values might be samples from another study, samples from another location, or some sort of a threshold that indicates whether our sample is good or bad, or harmful or not harmful. Whatever the case may be, now it's time to put our data into context. We'll also want to briefly list our limitations. We don't want to go overboard here because there are a lot of inherent limitations in every study, and we don't need to spend the whole research report discussing all those limitations. But we should help the reader be aware of what are the major limitations if they're interpreting our data. Next, conclusions. So what were the big implications of the whole study? And see now that I've said implications of the study, not implications of any individual findings. What are the big picture insights that we learned from this study? So I mentioned I've posted a really good example. This example is a study that was done through many different earth and environmental science disciplines. It's a paleolimnological study. In other words, these authors took sediment cores and then took the cores back to the lab and analyzed, I believe, about a dozen different lines of evidence. So different chemical signatures, different isotopes, different biological signatures, looking at minute fossil records and other chemical ratios that indicate changes over time. And from this, they were able to reconstruct a long-term history and solve an issue that's been a very important unknown for decades. The study is really important, and it's a really good example of how to do and how to publish an original research article with lots of different complex types of information, because they tie it all together in a nice format. So it's a big paper. If you have time, have a look through there. I'm not going to test you on anything in that paper, but it is helpful, I think, to look at papers like this if you're wondering how to craft your own paper. The next type of journal article that I'll go over is the literature review. First, we have the abstract, same rules as before. Introduction, we have a problem statement. Notice now we don't have a study area, most likely, unless we're doing a literature review on a very specific topic within a very specific geographical area. So again, these aren't hard rules, these are just some suggestions on headings. When we talk about methods, we're talking about how we've searched for papers, the scope of papers, and the type of papers that we've considered. In other words, have we only considered journal articles, or do we also consider conference papers? Do we consider textbooks? There are other types of literature that can be included here. Once we've gone over the methods, now we get into the findings. And if we've got a literature review, the literature review will have one big topic, but there will often be several subtopics embedded within that. And now we can get a little bit more specific in terms of subtopics. So within each topic, we might go through some detailed information about that topic, so the types of studies completed, specific findings to date, and an easy way to do a literature review. It's not necessarily the best for the reader, but a fairly straightforward way to do a literature review is to spend about 1 to 2 paragraphs on each study and summarize how it was completed, what they found, what were their major findings. You can go on and go study by study. And then in the discussion section, you can summarize the big picture findings. So the key findings that are relevant to many different studies that you found. You'll see some recurring themes, or you can draw your own conclusions from having understood the results of many other studies. So what are the implications? And again, we have limitations. Every study has limitations, including literature reviews. What are the missing types of information that either haven't been studied or we couldn't find? And then the most important part is the conclusions. So again, what are the implications of what we've just found? What are the new insights? This should be something that we've learned that is not specifically stated in any paper. Those are findings, not conclusions. What are the big conclusions? What are the big takeaway messages? And again, I've provided an example on the lecture page. This is a paper by Kirk Nordstrom in Applied Geochemistry. And in this paper, Dr. Nordstrom walks through the history of modeling in geochemical modeling, the different types of models, the different ways they're applied, different ways they're misapplied, and he really gets into the philosophy of modeling. It's a really excellent paper. So I would recommend this if you're interested in learning how to do a really good literature review, but also if you're interested in geochemistry or geochemical modeling. So that's about it for this topic, actually fairly short lecture. When we have the literature review assignment, I'll give a little bit more of a detailed rubric, which will help you write the literature review. But for now, I think the most important thing is to start reading the literature, look up a few different literature reviews and see how they've done it. It's really the best way to learn how to do one, is to read a lot of different reviews and then to start writing one yourself. Okay, we'll see you next week.